Hello, hello, hello. Happy Monday. Welcome to part 2 of the Gary Heidnik case. All right, people. Let's finish this story. So we were talking about Gary Heidnik, how he had kidnapped Josephine, and she saw that big hole in the cement floor of the basement, and Gary started telling her his plans of bringing 10 different women down to his basement and getting them all pregnant. And he just wanted to have a big, happy family, and he wanted to control all these women. So let's just get right to it. Kidnappers like Gary Heidnik, they want the opportunity to manipulate their victim or their victims 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is the sense of absolute control that the kidnapper truly desires. Gary Heidnik was obsessed, and I mean obsessed, with this kind of power. His basement was his own personal domain, and Josephine was his very first subject. She was stunned and terrified. She realized she'd fallen into the hands of a monster, but she wasn't going to submit to Gary's twisted desires without a fight. As soon as Gary went back upstairs, Josephine shuffled across the room as far as her chains would allow her to do. She made it to one of the windows along the wall, and she pushed it open with a discarded pool cue she had found on the floor. She was able to launch her body halfway out that window, but the chain around her ankle held her tight, and she couldn't go any further. She began to scream, hoping that someone might hear her. But in Gary's high-crime neighborhood, nobody gave her cries a second thought. I'm sure they were used to hearing all kinds of noises and screams in that area. The only person who responded was scary fucking Gary. He rushed over and dragged her all the way back into the basement, and then he began to beat her until she cried out to him that she just couldn't take it anymore. Then he shoved her into the pit. It was barely big enough for Josephine to fit inside. She had to literally curl up with her neck bent and her legs folded against her chest. But Gary didn't care about her comfort at all. He covered the hole with a piece of plywood and placed bags of dirt on top to weigh it down. Trapped underground, Josephine sobbed. Gary turned on the radio to drown out her cries, and he just fucking went back upstairs. He was already making a plan to kidnap his next victim. And his next victim was 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay. She was an easy target because she already knew Gary and she trusted him. They had met while Sandra was at the Alwyn Institute, which was a local nonprofit that serviced individuals that had autism, intellectual and developmental disabilities. Gary frequently hung around the institute to pick up women and bring them back home for sex. After meeting Gary, Sandra attended sessions at his church and agreed to sleep with him several times, although it's not clear she really had the capacity to actually give consent. Gary had even gotten her pregnant, but she went and terminated that pregnancy on her own. So afterwards, when he had heard about the abortion, Gary offered her $1,000 to let him get her pregnant again. She declined. So, that bitch decided that if he couldn't bribe her into bearing his children, he'd have to force her to do it instead. On November 29th, about 2 days after kidnapping Josephine, Gary ran into Sandra. Sandra was running errands at a corner store near her house. He coerced her to come home with him. Once she was inside, he dragged her into the basement. I was going to say apartment, but he literally dragged her straight down to the basement. Josephine was still trapped in the pit, so he pulled Josephine out and resumed digging the hole. He needed to make it large enough to fit both of the women. After that, he raped both of them. His birthing harem, as he called it, was underway. But it wasn't long before Gary hit a snag. When Sandra Lindsay had not returned home that night, her family was very worried. They began calling her friends, asking about her whereabouts. One of them suggested that she might be with Gary. So on the morning of November 30th, Sandra's sister and 2 of her cousins showed up at Gary's house looking for her. Gary refused to answer, but he knew they'd be back unless he did something to make them less suspicious of him. Later on that same day, he brought a pen and some paper into the basement, and he dictated a message for Sandra to write. So Sandra scrawled, "Dear Mom, do not worry, I will call." And underneath that, she signed her name, and then Gary made her address the envelope to her mother. Gary then drove the letter all the way to New York City, and he dropped it into a mailbox. He wanted Sandra's family to see the postmark and assume that Sandra had just run away. But when Sandra's mother received that letter, she did not at all believe that Sandra had written it of her own free will. It just wasn't like Sandra to leave town on her own. When she reported her daughter missing to the police, there was very little response. Unfortunately, once the responding officer saw the letter, he figured Sandra was safe and that she would return home when she was ready. But Sandra's mother still insisted that the police department look into Gary. The first name meant nothing to the officer, but if he had been able to see Gary's criminal record, I'm certain that it would have certainly given him pause. After all, Gary had already kidnapped a woman with an intellectual disability, just like Sandra. He'd even gone to prison for it. But unfortunately, when the officer questioned Sandra's friend about Gary, that friend accidentally misspelled Gary's last name. When the officer eventually typed the name into the system, there were no results. So he gave the case less priority and made few follow-up efforts to search for Sandra. In the meantime, Gary took extra steps to avoid getting caught. He started soundproofing his basement to ensure that no one would hear his captive's screams. He also beat both women relentlessly to discourage them from trying to run away. Weeks went by, and Gary kept Sandra and Josephine shackled 24 hours a day. He didn't let them bathe or even comb their hair. When nobody came to rescue the women, they became defeated, and Gary grew confident. By December 22nd of 1986, he was ready for a new addition to his harem. That Monday afternoon, he cruised around the streets of Philadelphia in his Cadillac until he came upon a 19-year-old woman named Lisa Thomas. Lisa fit the profile of all of Gary's victims. She was a young black woman with low income. When she saw Gary's fancy car, she waved, which of course caught his attention. He pulled over and offered her a ride to wherever she was going. Impressed by Gary's car, Lisa agreed. As they drove, Gary was flirting with her and smothering her with a bunch of compliments. Then he asked if she'd like to go to Atlantic City with him. She replied that she had nothing to wear for such a trip, so he drove her to Sears. Ooh, remember Sears? Oh my gosh. But anyways, he brought her there, and he handed her a $50 bill and told her to buy whatever she wanted. So Lisa was totally won over. After purchasing a few new outfits, because you could get a lot of cute stuff at Sears for $50, you know, she decided to go home with Gary. They went back to his house, and after he'd given her a glass of wine, she reportedly passed out. So at first, when I was doing my research, I thought that maybe he had drugged her, but apparently she had taken an allergy medication before, and she had a reaction with it when she mixed it with that alcohol. But when Lisa regained consciousness, Gary brought her to his room, and then they had sex. When they were done, she asked him if he would give her a ride to her friend's house, and Gary fucking snapped. He grabbed her by the throat and he began to strangle her. She tried to fight him off, but he wouldn't let her go. He snapped a pair of handcuffs on her wrists and brought her down to the basement with the others. Once they were down in the basement, Gary pulled Josephine and Sandra out of the pit where he had left them. He introduced them to Lisa as if they were welcoming a new guest in their home. Then he offered his prisoners a meal of peanut butter sandwiches. But before they were allowed to eat, he raped his newest prisoner. For Lisa, the assault was a grim initiation into what would become a horrific daily routine, and there was no end in sight. By the end of 1986, Gary Heidnik was totally laser focused on one twisted goal: kidnapping 10 women and imprisoning them in his Philadelphia basement so that he could force them to bear his children. Now that he had already managed to keep 3 young women captive, he was eager to grow his harem. Around New Year's Day of 1987, he went out scouting again, and that's when he found 23-year-old Deborah Johnson Dudley, and he brought her home. A little over 2 weeks later, he met an 18-year-old sex worker named Jacqueline Askins. She went home with him too, expecting it to be a typical business transaction. But when she got there, he showed her some of the arcade games he had been collecting, and she started playing one of them. Like, for me, if this would have been me, I mean, it's not about me, but I fucking love Ms. Pac-Man. So if I was at somebody's house and they had this arcade style Ms. Pac-Man game, fuck yeah, I would be all in, and I would be playing that game, and I would be soon trapped in that hole in the motherfucking basement. I can tell you that right now. I am a sucker for Ms. Pac-Man. But anyways, she was distracted by the game, and he put her in a headlock and dragged her down to the basement as well. Fucking Gary, scary fucking Gary, was elated to have more women under his control, but he expressed his pleasure in increasingly depraved acts of cruelty. He beat the women with a shovel handle often, and sometimes he forced them to beat each other with it as well. He did not want the women to develop any kind of camaraderie because he didn't want them to be fucking friends. He didn't want them to have a chance to rise up against him. So he tried to make them resent each other as much as possible. And he did this by playing favorites, especially with Josefina Rivera, because she was the most compliant out of all of them. She had it worked out in her mind that obedience equaled survival. Gary also manipulated the women by picking one and only one to reward with special treats like ice cream or Chinese food. And his tactics worked. Eventually, the women were too worn down to resist him. But even when they cooperated, it didn't stop Gary from punishing them. It was a compulsion that he could not resist. While not all sexual sadists have violent impulses that end in murder, Gary's whole world seemed to revolve around degrading and torturing these women, so it was pretty clear that a deadly outcome was inevitable. In February, after more than 2 months of being held captive, 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay became ill. She was vomiting and feverish. Gary was pleased because he thought her sickness might be a sign of pregnancy, but his mood changed when Sandra lost her appetite. Gary worried that his baby wasn't getting enough to eat, so he tried to force feed her some bread. When she refused, he became enraged and decided to teach her a lesson. Gary hooked one of her chains to a beam in the ceiling. She hung there. Guys, she hung there for at least 2 days, suspended by just one wrist. Eventually, she passed away, and it's possible that the weight of her own limp body squeezed the air out of her lungs and caused her to asphyxiate. Words are hard, insanely hard. Asphyxiate. Okay. So that's super sad. When Gary saw that Sandra had died, his reaction was cold and calculating. He felt zero remorse about torturing this woman to death. All he fucking cared about was getting rid of the body so that he wouldn't get caught. He knew he had to be careful. Sandra's family had already shown up at his place looking for her. And despite his efforts to make it look like she'd run away to New York, Gary knew that he was definitely going to be suspect number fucking 1 if Sandra was found dead. He had one idea how to solve the problem, though. It was perhaps his most disturbing act yet. He used an electric saw to dismember Sandra's body. Allegedly, after that, he ground up what body parts he could, and he fed them to his 2 dogs. He set aside her skull and tossed it in a pot of boiling water. Other parts he tried to incinerate in his oven, and he roasted her body parts. The smell of burning flesh filled the house. The women downstairs gagged from the stench. The smell was even noticeable from outside. Gary's neighbors had always ignored some of his questionable behavior before, but when they caught wind of the stomach fucking churning scent, they called the police. It wasn't long before police officers stopped by Gary's house to investigate. Around 5 p.m. on February 10th, when questioned about that peculiar smell, Gary said that he'd burned a roast. He seemed calm and lucid, so the officer didn't see any reason to go inside and look around. Satisfied, he went on his way. But Sandra's death and the police visit rattled Gary. Suddenly he became paranoid, and he worried that his scheme was unraveling and that perhaps the women sensed that he was now vulnerable. Deborah Dudley, the most rebellious of all of Gary's captives, helped devise a plan of attack. She told the others that she planned to hit Gary over the head with an iron pipe that they had found buried in the dirt under the floor, and she wanted the others to attack him while he was still stunned. However, that plan fell apart before Deborah could strike because apparently fucking Josephine confessed to Gary, wanting to earn his trust in hopes that it might buy her freedom. While it's stupid, I mean, I understand it because she's under such duress that she's like trying to grasp at any straw that she can to survive. So I get it. It's irritating, but I get it. When Gary found out about what Deborah was planning to do, he dished out his most brutal punishment yet. He took screwdrivers and he drove them into all of their ears. And, of course, this pierced their eardrums. He reasoned that if they couldn't hear, it would be harder for them to devise any more schemes to try to overpower him. And Josephine was the only woman spared of this torture. The more Gary inflicted pain on his prisoners, the more he seemed to enjoy it. As bad as the first few months of captivity were, the worst were still to come. Gary continued to beat and rape the women daily. He also taunted them with threats that he would grind up pieces of Sandra's body and mix it in with their food. In March of 1987, he came up with a new method of torture. Gary cut off the end of an electric extension cord and stripped the protective coating, which of course left that wire bare. He began administering shocks to the women whenever he fucking felt like it, whenever it suited him, whenever. On Wednesday, March 18th, he decided that they needed to be punished more severely. He ordered Deborah, Lisa, and Jacqueline to sit in the underground pit and to use the hose to fill it with water. As the women sat shivering in the homemade pool, Gary prepared the extension cord. Either he or Josephine, under his instruction, pressed that live wire to the metal chains that restrained the women. This electric current ran through the metal and it coursed through the prisoners' bodies. Moments later, 23-year-old Deborah went silent and limp. The other women called out, "You've killed her!" But Gary didn't even fucking care. When he looked into the pit, he saw Deborah slumped over and her face was underwater. Gary pulled the women out and laid Deborah's body across the floor. After confirming that she was dead, he looked at the other women and said, "Aren't you glad it wasn't one of you?" Gary made the most of Deborah's death. He saw this as a fucking disgusting opportunity to tighten his control over his other captives. He grabbed a pen and paper and told Josephine to write out a confession letter which admitted her role in Deborah's death. He told her, "If you ever go to the cops, I can use this as evidence that you killed Debbie." Gary made the other women sign the sheet as witnesses with this letter. Now, he was satisfied that he would be able to blackmail Josephine whenever the fuck he wanted to. He was so certain now that she would never defy him that he decided he could grant her a little more freedom. He removed Josephine from her chains, gave her a clean outfit to wear, and he allowed her to go upstairs. Over the next few days, he gave Josephine free rein of the entire house. He acted as if Josephine were his girlfriend by confiding in her, ruminating on what he would do if he were caught. As far as he was concerned, he and Josephine were accomplices, and they were both responsible for Deborah's death. He truly believed that she couldn't go to the police without implicating herself. So he enlisted her help in getting rid of Deborah's body. Gary wrapped the corpse in a blanket, carried it out to his car, and told Josephine how to get in the passenger seat. Or he told her to get into the passenger seat. She was afraid, but she knew the more that Gary trusted her, the better her chances would be of staying alive. So she got into the car. She sat in that passenger seat. Gary drove them about 40 miles east into the forest of New Jersey. He parked in a desolate spot in the middle of the Pine Barrens. and Josephine watched over the car while Gary dumped Deborah's body among the trees before returning the vehicle. She should have just driven off. Like, how amazing would that have been if she would have just took off in his car? I'm sure she was scared as fuck. I can't, I'm not in that position. You're not in that position. When you're hearing these stories, or I'm telling you about the story in a podcast, it's really easy just to say, she should have left. She could have done this. She could have done that. It's fucking scary. But it would have been amazing. As they drove home, Gary began plotting again. First Sandra and now Deborah. He'd wanted 10 women to birth his children. But now he was down to just 3. So it was time for him to scout some more victims. The next morning, Gary sought out a sex worker that he had hired in the past. Her name was Agnes Adams, and she was 24 years old. He had paid her for a blowjob just a month prior, but apparently Gary had not been interested in kidnapping her at that time. But this time, however, it was a totally different story. Gary offered her $30 for an appointment, luring her to his home. He brought her to his room to have sex with her, but as she got ready to leave, he grabbed her by the neck, just like the others. He handcuffed her, just like the others, and dragged her to the basement. In the aftermath of the attack, he felt very confident that he could repopulate his birthing harem in no time at all. Meanwhile, Josephine had been keeping a close eye on Gary, and she was ready to take advantage of his good mood. The next day, she asked him if she could go visit her family. By then, she had convinced him completely that she had no interest at all in running away from him. She told him that if he allowed her to leave for a few hours, she would bring back a new woman for the basement. So, of course, Gary agreed. He still had her confession letter as insurance, and he was so fucking convinced that he had manipulated all of the women into submission. It did not even occur to him that one of them could be tricking him. So, on the night of March 24th, 1987, Gary dropped Josephine off near her old neighborhood. But before he left, he told her to meet him at a gas station parking lot at midnight. She, of course, promised him that she would. Once Gary was out of her sight, Josephine raced to her ex-boyfriend Vincent's apartment. As soon as he opened the door, Josephine told him everything. Hearing her tale of rape and torture, could you imagine somebody telling you this? I can't even imagine. Vincent was ready to grab a fucking weapon and go looking for Gary himself, but Josephine had convinced him to call the police instead. So they called 911 from a payphone, because of course there's no cell phones back then. Moments later, 2 policemen came to meet them. Josephine repeated her story to the officers. She told them that 3 other women were still in captivity, and she was absolutely fucking terrified that Gary would kill them if she didn't return. The officers stared at her in disbelief. The accusations seemed too grotesque to actually be true, but when Josephine showed them the marks on her arms and her wrists, the scars left by prolonged use of handcuffs and chains, they finally agreed to go investigate. Go do your fucking job, They have to be, talked into doing their job sometimes. It's kind of crazy. Anyway, Josephine had told the police where Gary would be waiting to pick her up at midnight, and the police agreed to go check it out. When they arrived at the gas station, Gary was sitting inside his Cadillac. The officers drew their guns, approached his car, and asked Gary to step outside the vehicle. Gary raised his hands and he exited the car immediately. Despite the guns pointed at him, he didn't seem at all worried, and he just asked them if they were coming to hassle him about the child support he owed Betty. But then Josephine stepped forward. According to one of the officers who arrived at the scene, Josephine pointed to Gary and started to cry out, "That's him. He raped me and killed those 2 other girls." The officer placed Gary under arrest and took him into custody. Meanwhile, more officers arrived to take Josephine's statement. While retelling her story, Josephine, of course, I can understand this, she grew increasingly agitated, asking if anyone was going back to the house for the other women. She asked them again and again, and she kept growing more and more frantic. It was another 4 hours before police were finally given the command to search Gary's house of horrors. And despite what Josephine had told them, none of them were at all prepared for the scene they would find. After they broke the front door down with a crowbar and stampeded into Gary's house, their senses were immediately assaulted. The smell of death hung in the air, and the television and radio were blaring. The thermostat was set to a blisteringly high temperature, and with all of these things combined, it made for a disorientating atmosphere. As the police trampled through the kitchen, one of the officers spotted fragments of what could have been human bones inside of a roasting pan. But a far more horrifying discovery awaited them in the basement. The police went downstairs, and that's where they found Lisa Thomas and Jacqueline Askins, both chained to the wall. Both of the women were fast asleep. They jerked awake, though, as the officers surrounded them. For a moment, I'm sure they were too bewildered to even understand that they were even being rescued. Can you imagine that? When the realization finally hit them, though, they began crying in relief. They pointed to the pit in the middle of the room, which was covered in plywood, and it was weighed down with sandbags. When police peered inside, that's where they found Agnes Adams. Agnes was terrified, but still fairly healthy. After all, she'd only been trapped for a couple of days, so she was not as shockingly malnourished as the other 2 women were. The authorities transported all 3 of them to the hospital. Their agonizing ordeal was finally over, but that could not change the fates of Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley. Sandra's mother was devastated to learn that her suspicions were correct. All along, she had been pushing police to investigate Gary, but they had essentially just dropped the matter. Her mother told reporters that they could have saved all of them. The authorities were certainly paying attention now, though. After finding Sandra Lindsay's remains, they went to work searching for more bodies to recover. They could not discount the possibility that Gary had been killing for years. Over the next few days, they thoroughly searched Gary's apartment on North Marshall Street, bringing in backhoes and sand sifters to excavate his yard. They conducted a similar search of the house on Cedar Avenue where Gary had lived years previous. As authorities pored over Gary's life with a fine-tooth comb, Gary himself remained locked up in Philadelphia Detention Center without bail. He was attacked by another prisoner shortly after he was detained. So, for his own safety, he was transferred to the psychiatric unit of the penitentiary. Apparently, these precautions could not protect Gary from himself, though. A little over a week after his arrest, Gary tried to hang himself in the bathroom using his own shirt. Guards rescued him before it was too late, which meant Gary was alive to stand trial for capital murder. But lawyers had to contend with another obstacle: the question of Gary's mental fitness. All right, guys, so before I continue, I want to play you the trailer of one of my most favorite true crime podcasts right now. This married couple is fucking hilarious. Like, Jess is a fucking saint because she puts up with Russ. And let me just tell you, like, when I first found their podcast, it was recommended to me on Spotify because of other podcasts I listened to. So I listened to them, and I could not fucking stand Russ. I really couldn't. I thought he was obnoxious and stupid. And I did like his Bronx accent, okay? Because my boyfriend's from the Bronx area originally. So I did like that. But he was rubbing me the wrong way. And by the third episode that I listened to, I was in love with both of them, and I was a fan of Russ the Profiler. So if you're ever listening for another podcast, they do not need me, little old me, to promote them, but I love them so much, and I'm really enjoying their podcast. And especially like the way, like, I don't love a lot of banter in podcasts, but they have like a really, really great, like, it's harmonious and it's funny as fuck. Like, I listen to them while I'm walking my dogs and I laugh my fucking ass off. So if you ever see me, if you live in Pensacola and you see me walking my dogs, or if you see me walking by myself, or if you see me at the gym working out and I'm fucking laughing, it's because I'm listening to Wife of Crime. Check it out.
Hey everyone, my name is Jess, and I'm the co-host of a weekly true crime podcast called Wife of Crime. Every week, I tell my husband one of my favorite true crime stories, and he reacts to them. Sometimes I get mad at him. You're gonna really regret all of this judginess that you're doing right now once I tell you this story, because you're being very judgmental.
Obviously something bad's gonna happen. She's making a lot of bad decisions.
Well, you're being very judgmental. Stop. And sometimes he makes really weird noises.
Oh!
He now thinks that he's an FBI profiler. Yeah.
How about that? Russ the Profiler, placebo effect.
But most of the time, he just has really funny color commentary.
Wow, so he's sitting in his human leather chair, eating fruity pebbles out of a skull.
You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts, and check us out on Instagram at Wife of Crime Pod.
Yeah, you got to check them out. Fucking hilarious. I do have to say that there is no way ever that I could have my boyfriend be on my podcast with me. It would just not work out. I don't edit my podcast, and I know for a fact that he would say so many things that would need to be edited out, and I'm not running my podcast that way. I just hit record and I just go. And I honestly just like doing my podcast solo. But if you're a person that likes to hear more than one person on a podcast, you must check them out. All right, so the guards rescued that piece of fucking shit before it was too late. And so Gary's going to still be able to stand trial for the capital murder. But lawyers had to contend with another major obstacle, the question of Gary's mental fitness. A few days after Gary's suicide attempt, he hired a defense lawyer by the name of Charles Peruto Jr. This lawyer wasted absolutely no time laying the groundwork for an insanity defense for his client. He even started describing Gary as being insane to the press. Gary's demeanor added to this image. Reporters noticed and commented on his distinctive way of dressing during court appearances. So Gary often styled himself in the same fucking outfit again and again and again. It was a dirty buckskin jacket with fringe and an old Hawaiian shirt. During these appearances, he often appeared vacant. He even drooled on occasion, although this could have been because he'd been prescribed large doses of Thorazine, which is a medication used to treat psychotic disorders while they're in custody. Prosecutors could only hope that Gary's odd behavior would not sway a jury. If Gary were declared insane, he would most likely spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital. But that wasn't good enough for the district attorney's office. And it's not good enough for me either. They were going for the death penalty. Yeah. Shout out to everybody who's good with the death penalty for those who are deserving of the death penalty. I'm not always across the board good for it, but in this case, fuck yeah. Anyways, Gary's notoriety was also a challenge for the trial. The grisly details of his crimes dominated the airwaves for days. Predictably, the media seized upon the shocking details of every single one of Gary's horrific acts, his eccentric behavior, his secret stock market trades, and the disturbing racial implications of, he is a fucking white man holding vulnerable Black women captive. Taking all this in, Gary's defense attorney argued that it would be impossible to select an impartial jury. He said that the sensationalized media coverage had already prejudiced the public against Gary. So, as the trial date drew near, the judge in the case approved the defense's request to select an out-of-town jury. Jurors were brought in from Pittsburgh, and in June of 1988, the trial finally began. Charles Peruto Jr. made no attempt at all to deny that Gary had tortured and killed his captives, but he did argue that Gary could not be held responsible for these murders. He called on several psychiatrists to testify to that effect. They discussed Gary's long history with schizophrenia and mental illness and testified that Gary was suffering from delusions that made it impossible for him to control his actions. The prosecution, relying on their own mental health experts, agreed that Gary was undeniably mentally ill. However, they argued that Gary didn't meet the legal definition of insanity because of the fact that Gary fucking knew what he'd done was wrong. If he had not been aware, he would not have gone to such great lengths to cover up his crimes. For example, remember, Gary made calculated efforts to soundproof his basement so that nobody could hear his prisoners. He also attempted to throw police off by sending Sandra Lindsay's letters from New York, and he made sure to hide the bodies of his victims to avoid detection. Whatever delusions Gary experienced, his actions demonstrated that he was 100% fucking fully aware that he was breaking the law. Testimony dragged on for nearly 2 weeks, but at the beginning of July 1988, the jury returned a verdict. They found Gary guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape. After everything the victims and their poor families had been through, they were relieved but surprised, honestly surprised, to see justice prevail, especially since the whole thing required a Caucasian jury to sentence a Caucasian man to death. Gary didn't want to appeal his conviction, but he made another suicide attempt. In January of 1989, around 3 a.m. one morning, death row guards discovered Gary unconscious in his cell. He'd been hoarding his prescribed Thorazine tranquilizers, probably hiding them inside his cheeks for weeks or maybe even months. He then used them to overdose. This suicide attempt left him in a coma for 2 days, and he was placed under constant suicide watch. After he regained consciousness, guards supervised him around the clock and checked his mouth to make sure he swallowed his pills. But Gary was determined to die. He filed a petition to speed up his execution. Pennsylvania death penalty cases are subject to automatic appeals, meaning the process can often drag on for years and years and years. And Gary was not interested in having the inevitable being delayed. He wanted to be executed ASAP. According to the criminal justice expert Meredith Martin Roundtree, approximately 10% of people executed in the United States are prisoners who sought or at some point declined to contest their own execution. They're commonly called volunteers, and these prisoners succeed in hastening execution by waiving their right to full judicial review of their conviction and sentence. Roundtree cited various reasons for this in the 2018 book, which was called Living on Death Row, The Psychology of Waiting to Die. I have not read this book yet. I want to look for it, though, because it seems really, really interesting to me. So she said that some prisoners may seek to die out of a need for autonomy, and a desire to control their destiny. I might not need a third glass of wine. Anyways, this theory makes sense for someone like Gary, who is so often driven by the need to be in fucking control of everything at all times. But in this case, Gary's fate was literally out of his hands. The court rejected his request to speed up his execution after Gary's petition was denied, which I think is funny. His case took 8 years. 8 years, guys. 8 fucking years to proceed through the court system. I mean, I sound super excited about that, right? Because I fucking am. Like, he wanted to die fast, but it took 8 years to proceed through the court system. So, fucking Gary Heidnik did not get what he wanted. So, yeah, fuck yeah, I'm excited about that. His automatic appeals were finally exhausted. His execution was scheduled for April of 1997. However, as this date approached, there was another delay from an unlikely source. Gary's 19-year-old daughter, Maxine had never met her father since she had been removed from his custody as an infant. Still, the thought of letting him die without a fight didn't sit right with her. Maxine argued that Gary was not competent enough to be executed, and she filed a lawsuit on his behalf. She requested a last-minute reprieve, and after 2 more years of legal battles, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court unanimously upheld Gary's sentence. 55-year-old Gary Heidnik died by lethal injection on July 6th of 1999. Gary's death more than 20 years ago, and his was the last execution ever carried out by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which is cool, I think. So it was the very last one. Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge felt that the ultimate punishment was the only suitable outcome for Gary. The governor remarked that he had suffered far less, and I agree, than the women he tortured and killed. It would be nice to think that Gary's death finally helped alleviate the pain he had caused. Indeed, after the execution, Deborah Dudley's sister Carolyn Johnson expressed a hope for closure. But for the survivors of Gary's House of Horrors, nothing can ever erase the agony and terror they endured in that basement. In the year 2014, more than 25 years after her ordeal, Josefina Rivera spoke of the pain she carries with her still to this day. Oh my gosh, I can only imagine. But she said, You don't ever totally get over an experience like mine. You just have to learn to live with it. And that's the case, guys. That's it. It's horrifying. I'm horrified by the fact that these women had to go through this, and hope they're okay. And I hope that they're able to move on. I mean, take it day by day. But whatever good vibes you have going out, focus on them. This was one of those cases that in my research, it was like heavily influenced by the fucking criminal. And sometimes that happens. And you guys know, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you already know that I really, really like to advocate for the victims whenever possible. And so much of this case just really talked about fucking Gary. Scary fucking Gary. But he's dead. And honestly, I think payback was the fact that he wanted to die. And he wanted to die quickly because he wanted to still have control. And all of that control was I'm so glad about it, but all of that control was taken away from him, and he had to wait and wait and wait on death row, and he had to wait for 8 years before he was finally put to death by lethal injection. And I just think that is awesome. If only they would have been able to handcuff him to a wall or stick him in a hole in a cement floor in that prison, that would have been better. But hey, I mean, I'm just glad that he's gone. And this is a case like anybody who's for the death penalty, will be celebrating that he is no longer on this earth, breathing our atmosphere or having any kind of even fantasies about anything that he's done or could potentially do again in the future. So I just really feel for the women who have survived this. And I really feel for the people who have lost their loved ones, the ones that have died. So anyways, guys, I'm not sure what case I'm going to do next week. I'm working on notes for 3 different cases, because it's spooky season, so it's getting closer and closer to Halloween. And are you guys dressing up? Do you guys have costume ideas? I would love to hear from you. DM me or put in some kind of comment in this episode, in the show notes on like Instagram. I'm going to be posting about this episode on Instagram, and sometimes I do on Facebook, but just on my personal. I haven't started a podcast Facebook yet, just because I just feel like it's just too much, but I'm on Instagram, and that's where I'm going to stay. So if you want to go ahead and tell me in the comments what you're doing for Halloween costumes, that would be really exciting for me. I am going to be Poison Ivy for one of my costumes. So I'm Poison Ivy. I just had my hair. You already know I'm a redhead, but I just had my color redone. Well, what day is it now? So on Thursday, so 2 days ago, I had it. Well, you're listening to this on Sunday. But anyways, it's Saturday when I'm recording, and I had my color touched up on Thursday. And that's why I didn't get to record on Thursday, because I was in the fucking chair. I was in my friend Kathy's chair for like 4 fucking hours, because that's what it takes. That's what it takes. So I'm willing to do it. But 4 fucking hours. And I'm being Poison Ivy. My boyfriend, I wanted him to be Batman or something like DC Comics. And of course, he didn't want to do that because he doesn't like DC Comics. So he's being Tony Stark, so we're not even going to go together. But whatever. That's actually more, that's like 100% true in real life too. And then we have another costume that we had gotten last year, and we ended up not really even dressing up last year. But we're supposed to go to a Halloween party next weekend, and if we do go to it, we're going to wear our last year's costumes that are still unworn. So I'm like Jane Fonda or some kind of like 80s aerobics chick. And then he is going to be Richard fucking Simmons, and it's going to be hilarious because, yeah, he tried on his costume, I remember last year, and he was a really fucking ugly Richard Simmons, so that should be funny. I will be sure to post pictures on the Instagram and in my stories and all that kind of stuff if you guys want to check out our costumes. But yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited about spooky season. Did I even tell you guys about Dahlia, my outside kitty that adopted me? She had fucking kittens, right? I found them in, I think it was August I found them. There's 2 here still, Harley and Pocus. Hocus disappeared. I don't know what happened to Hocus. I don't even want to think about something bad happening. I'm hoping that Hocus got like somewhere in the neighborhood here, somebody else kind of started feeding and maybe brought Hocus into their home. I really, really love Hocus, but don't tell Pocus, but Harley's my favorite. Harley has a great personality, and Pocus is all black and super shy. But basically, my front porch is full of black cats, like live black cats. Like that is my Halloween decor this year, black cats. And I'm pissed because Dahlia went and got herself fucking knocked up again. So she's going to have more babies. So if you're in the Pensacola area and you know of anybody that wants to give a kitten to someone responsible, they have to be responsible and loving. For Christmas, I'm going to have some Christmas kittens available. Like, I rub Dahlia's little tummy and massage her every day, and I can feel those little babies in there, but I'm so pissed. I need to find somebody that can come and trap the male stray cat that's been around here for months and months. He hangs out at the neighbor's house. He's got the grossest, biggest set of ugly, nasty balls that you could ever even imagine. And I don't want him to be hurt, but I don't want him on our property unless his nuts are cut off. So he needs to be castrated, neutered right now because I cannot do this again. This will be the second time, and I cannot do it again. It's just too much. And it's crazy because I'm a dog person and I'm like surrounded by all these cats, and I've started researching stuff about cats. If you're not a cat person, did you know that cats are literally on this planet just to procreate? Like, that's their whole goal, is to have as many babies as possible. It's just crazy. But anyways, and then my little Jasmine, my little Maine Coon mixed kitty, is inside the house, and she likes to hang out. I have to open up the blinds for her so she can just like sit there and be like the nosy neighbor and watch the outside kitties. But anyways, I'm so tempted to make Harley an inside kitty. I have to bring her to the vet and get all her stuff going, but oh my gosh, I just am in love with her. But anyways, guys, I'm going to stop chit-chatting. I don't know how many of you are even still listening to me, but I'm going to let you go. I love you. Remember to hit that follow button. Remember to review if you can. 5 stars. 5 fucking stars. And if you could be so inclined, go on to Apple Podcasts and leave me a review. That really, really helps me be seen by more people. And this podcast is growing slowly but surely, and I'm so very excited about that, and it's all because of you guys. Until next time, gang, keep talking crime.